Okay, hello everyone. Welcome. Welcome to today's webinar, Engage, Build, Consolidate, an Effective Framework for Lesson Planning, presented by André Hedlund. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us on today's webinar from so many different places. There's already over 150 of you, and I've seen in the chat that you're coming from all over, and we really appreciate you joining us today. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to take a minute to go over some of the functionality of the webinar platform. First off, at the bottom of your screen, you'll notice that there are several icons. The first button on the left is the chat function. You can use the chat to interact with the presenter and other attendees. But be sure to send your message to all panelists and attendees to make sure that the whole group can see your message. As a reminder, please keep the chat focused on the session as well. On the right, you'll see a Q&A button. Please use this button to ask the presenters or the host questions. We will do our best to answer your questions as they come in. And finally, we will be sending along a certificate of attendance, a recording of the session, and slides within 5 business days of the webinar to the email address you used to register for today's event. Okay? So without further ado, it is my great honor to introduce today's speaker. André Hedlund is a Chevening alumnus, Masters of Sciences in Psychology of Education from the University of Bristol, and an Edify bilingual program mentor for SPOT Education. He is also a representative of Braz Teasol's Mind, Brain, and Education Special Interest Group, and a guest lecturer in postgraduate courses on multilingualism, global education, cognition, and neuroscience. He has worked as an EFL teacher for 15 years in Brazil and for National Geographic Learning as a consultant and as a reviewer. His blog, edcrocks.com, has been accessed more than 40,000 times by people from more than 140 countries. He uses Instagram at edcrocks to host monthly lives about how neuroscience and psychology can be applied in the classroom and interviews teachers from all over the world. André, welcome.
Thank you very much, Anders, and it's such a pleasure for me to be here again. So I'm very excited because normally when we do things like this, when we have one lesson after the other, the last session gets a little bit better because we've had the chance to practice before, right? So welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for mentioning where you're connecting from in the chat box. And it's such a wonderful feeling to realize that I'm talking to people from all over the world. I hope I can teach you something useful. I hope I can actually give you some insightful information on how we can use the science of learning to adapt some of our lesson planning strategies and hopefully help our students achieve better learning outcomes. So let's talk about the agenda. I'm going to talk about the Renaissance and Leonardo da Vinci because for some reason, when I was teaching a course a couple of weeks ago, somebody gave me that narrative, and I actually thought it was a brilliant move. I think that the Renaissance and especially Leonardo da Vinci and some other painters like Michelangelo, they were really concerned about, integrating arts and science. And that brings us to the science of learning. This framework in particular, Engage, Build, and Consolidate, how you can plan using this framework. So I'm going to give you some concrete examples, my final considerations, and then the framework that I developed when I was writing my dissertation last year at the University of Bristol. So let's get started. The very first photo that I want to show you after this beautiful painting of Leonardo da Vinci is something that comes in the wonderful materials that National Geographic Learning offers, right? So this one I got from Impact, and you can see that this is quite a spectacular photo that was taken in the air, mid-air. People were flying, or at least, they were gliding over the city of Dubai. And then it says right there on the top, from flying dinosaurs to jetpacks, the ability to soar among the clouds has always captivated our imagination. And I totally agree with that. I think we've always been obsessed with flying. And that brings me to Leonardo da Vinci. He was a scientist, an artist who actually designed some of the early prototypes of flying machines. And then this picture is separated by this period of artistic rebirth, especially in Italy, by about 400 years, right? So if you think about Leonardo da Vinci was active in the 1500s, and the only way he could record things was by writing very thorough descriptions and painting and drawing. And nowadays we can take photographs, amazing photographs, and we can take those photographs anywhere. So how much has science moved along, progressed? Think about that. And are we integrating science with arts? I think that photography plus designing gliders, for example, that's a great analogy. That's a great image for you to have to bear in mind of the potential that we can achieve when we integrate arts and science. But also, if we go back to Da Vinci, a true Renaissance man, he was obsessed with drawing the perfect figure. So he actually had a very, I would say, sort of disgusting hobby, which was to go to the morgue and draw corpses and then, learn about anatomy by observing dead bodies and, trying to draw them perfectly, so perfectly that even today, medical schools around the world use his drawings for anatomy classes, right? And what does that tell us? It tells us, if you look at the Vitruvian Man, which is probably one of the most popular sketches by Da Vinci, it tells us that whenever you use science or mathematics, which is the language of science, to understand formulas, to understand how the world works, you can probably have better results. So you can see that this is a perfect figure because he used science, he used the language of science to help him draw that one. And Da Vinci was truly a man ahead of his time. He designed the first glider, at least that we know of. And then only many hundreds of years after, probably 4 centuries after, we were able to create what he had anticipated back in the 16th century. So how amazing is that? And I really want to show you how enthusiastic I am about this, because I am a geek. I really like this idea of integrating science and arts. And as English teachers, educators, we are probably much more into arts and language arts and humanities than science. But I urge you to step away or step out of your comfort zone and start looking at the science and the contributions of science. I want you to think like a scientist. Just like Brendan Mullen says, ask questions, solve problems, think like a scientist, stay curious. Because scientists, they make an impact. They leave a legacy, a very rich legacy. Do like Da Vinci. Start observing things and drawing and writing down things and describing things so that many years after, people can refer, they can look back at what you have done, and then they can come up with other things based on your work. And that brings us to the science of learning. So the science of learning is something kind of new, kind of recent, and maybe you have never heard of it. So I'm going to ask Anders to help me here with the poll. How many of you have ever heard of this term before, the science of learning? So you can answer the poll right there. Let's wait for the results. If for some reason you cannot access the poll, you can use the chat box. Okay, the results are coming up. So most people have actually heard of the science of learning. 41%, 35% had never heard of the science of learning. And some people are not sure. Maybe you have, but you don't remember exactly if that was the exact term or if it was something related to that. But the science of learning is a very new or recent development of the way we look at how we learn. And there are many areas that we can attach to this umbrella term, such as the area that I represent here in Brazil, mind-brain education, the course that I took at the University of Bristol, educational neuroscience or psychology of education or educational psychology. They are somehow related to the science of learning because they basically do research on how the brain works, how the mind works, how we behave, and what are the consequences or the impacts of all of that together for learning. Now, if you think about it, the science of learning is definitely an asset for teachers, because we have to understand how we learn, how our students learn, and how we can teach them in a more, let's say, brain-friendly way so that they can learn more effectively. And based on the science of learning, and I really recommend you go to the website that I showed, scienceoflearning-ebc.com. You will find this framework that was developed by my professor, Paul Howard-Jones at the University of Bristol, plus collaborators. And it's very interesting because it's a guideline. It's not really a recipe. And I really have to emphasize this again, because I don't think there is a recipe for teaching. I think there are too many variables. It's a complex system. It's kind of like chaos theory, right? You have too many people in the same room. They have different interests and likes and dislikes. So you don't really have a fixed recipe that will always work for every single lesson that you teach. But you do have very interesting principles that you can use to guide how you plan, how you deliver your lesson, how you can reflect about the things that happened and the things that you can change. So the very first thing that we have to do as teachers, we have to engage our students, because if there's no engagement, there's no attention. If there's no attention, your students will not create new memories. If they don't have any memories, they haven't learned, have they? So engagement has to do with this communication that we can see inside our brains between subcortical regions that are more related to the emotional response that we have to environmental stimuli, or even stimuli that will come from within, and then the cortex. So the cortex is, especially the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, is more related to higher order cognitive skills and thinking and things like that, paying attention, inhibitory control. So engagement has an emotional aspect, but it also has a cognitive aspect and a behavioral aspect. And then you have to build new knowledge. You have to expose your students to new stuff. And that means that you have to activate those areas in the frontal lobe that refer to the working memory system. So the problem is our working memory system is very limited, right? So we cannot really throw a lot of information at our students, because we can cause something called cognitive overload. So we have to understand how the working memory system works. And finally, after the students have been exposed to this new knowledge, new content, and new skills, for example, they have to be able to consolidate that. So they have to settle that somewhere in the cortex. So they kind of throw all of that information back and all over the cortex, so it gets solidified or consolidated, right? And the way that they can do that basically is by rehearsing, by retrieving information, revisiting information with a certain frequency. If we do that, then we are probably on the right path. If we engage our students, start building knowledge, and help them consolidate learning, we are on the right path. But how can we do that? So let's take a look at ENGAGE. So I'm going to read some of the principles, and then I'm going to give you some examples of how you can use that to plan your lessons, okay? So the very first principle is that every brain is unique. So that means that students differ in how well they can control their attention and what engaged their attention. And I feel that everyone knows that, it's kind of that gut feeling that we have in the classroom when we talk to different people, that every single person will have different interests. So if I'm talking about a particular subject that some of my students will love, some other students might hate, might not be engaged, they might think it's boring. But also, not just about the uniqueness of our brain, it's also about an approach response, which has to do with stimulating rewards in the brain. We have a reward system. So how can we do that? We can praise our students when they deserve to be praised for their achievements, for example. And we can also work with novelty. So we can talk about things that are new, that they're curious about. We can give them voice and choice, and we can share attention, not just us, teachers with our students, but peers. So we can put students together in pairs so that they can talk to one another. And that's actually engaging for the brain. But we also have to reduce their fearfulness and their anxiety levels. Otherwise, their executive functions, their working memory system will be too full. They will not be able to attend to the information that we want them to. And finally, telling them that the brain is plastic, that the brain can always change and rewire itself, because that's what the brain does. The brain learns, right? We can always make new connections. Will actually help them realize that they can learn, because many times what stops your students from engaging is that feeling that they have, I'm not good enough, I don't have the talent that is required for me to do this. But they can learn because the brain is plastic. So how do you do that? The very first thing that you can do, and I think that we don't do this often enough, maybe, or maybe we do, I hope you do that. We can use games, because games are intrinsically engaging. So there is a unit in one of the great books. I'm actually using photos, images from Impact and Perspectives, two excellent National Geographic learning materials. And then one of the things we can do before we even start the unit. So the unit is about a fox exploring the city, and then we talk about different cities, we describe them. I want the students to activate that prior knowledge, but in a fun way, in an engaging way. So I can get pictures of different animals, because maybe they don't know how to say those animals in English. I can show them the pictures just like I'm doing right now, and I can ask them to try to guess, to try to remember. I can ask them, I don't know, maybe to do some research using their cell phones, if they are allowed to do that. I can show them some words. I can actually show the names of those animals and scramble the words so that they have to guess, because that's a game, that's engaging. Or I can quiz them. I can use Kahoot, I can use Mentimeter, I can do many things. The same thing for words. So throughout this unit, Impact 1, you will see that the book brings information about a lot of different cities, exploring the cities. So you can check if your students know where those cities are located. So you can, do a very simple matching game, right? And then it could be something time bound, so that it gives them a sense of, wow, I have to do this. I'm kind of, competing against myself. I'm trying to break the record or something like that. So it could be a gamified task, okay? Now we start the unit. So you can see the picture of this fox that looks very engaged, I guess, looking for different areas in the city, maybe looking for food or something like that. And then you can probably not read the text right next to the fox, but it says, a red fox exploring Bristol in the UK. And then when I was preparing for this session, I said, this is the perfect example of something that could be engaging, because I can personalize a little bit. Because I used to live in Bristol. This research, the science of learning EBC framework, is also something that was done in Bristol. So there are many connections. And then this is more engaging than simply looking at a picture of a fox in a city anywhere. If there's no connection, it's not going to be so engaging. And the very first question that you have there is, look at the photo. If you saw this in person, would it surprise you? Why or why not? And then you can talk about this. You can get, I think the photos are all engaging. They're excellent. They're amazing photos. But then if there is no connection to anything that matters to the student, maybe they are not going to be interested. Maybe they're not going to be engaged. And then there's a connection now, because I lived in Bristol, and then they worry, or they, I matter to them, I hope. So they are going to want to learn more about my story and the things that I've, lived throughout my life, my experiences. So I can make that connection for them. And it's a cute fox, somebody mentioned there. Yes. And then this is the city of Astana in Kazakhstan. And before I tell you anything about this, because this is the sequence of the lesson, I want Anders or Emily to help me with the poll. Do you think your students would be interested in learning a little bit more about Astana in Kazakhstan? What do you think? Because it might be a little too far away for them, or maybe it might be a city they've been to before. And so let's see. Let's wait for the results to come up. Yeah, somebody just mentioned, not sure, maybe not, right? Probably not, from Argentina, right? It depends on the student. Yes. So let's see, let's look at the answers. Well, 52% said yes, I think my students would be interested. 10% no, and 37% not sure. So that means that many students would actually probably not be interested in this city. And then what do you do with those students who are not interested? This is what the book offers. This is the lesson. This is the reading. We have to do the reading so that we can learn the vocabulary, so that we can do this activity here, right? We have to use vocabulary to describe the city: architecture, capital, residence, skyscraper. If they're not engaged because they don't like what the book offers, and this will happen, eventually, you can start by personalizing. Remember, every student has a unique brain. And one of the things that we can do, because we want them to learn the vocabulary, right there, you can ask them, what city would you like to know more about? Or what city do you like? What city are you interested in? And then do you think you can use those words in bold to describe that city, right? I'm not so engaged. I don't want to talk about Astana. Do you want to talk about London? Do you want to talk about New York? Do you want to talk about Beijing? And then right there, you make them more engaged, because again, what is the goal of this particular page, this lesson? For them to use the vocabulary: architecture, capital. They can do that with any city in the world. And then you can get your students to be a little bit more engaged, because they are doing what they want to do, what they're interested in doing, okay? Of course, we cannot always do that, but this is a very good tip for you to try to engage your students more. And then you can also personalize yourself. You can find a personal connection to that. And I did find, so, and this is a huge coincidence. When I was in Bristol, at the University of Bristol, I actually had a guy that shared the residential building. So we had dorms, right? And he was my neighbor. He was the next door neighbor. And his name was Bak Daulet. And he's on Facebook. And he's from Kazakhstan. And guess what? He actually lives in Astana. So there's a personal connection. So I could bring that. And then I remember that last night, and I said, I have to talk to this guy. I want him to send me a picture or a video of Astana so that I can make a real life connection with the content. And then he sent me a video of Astana's sunset. He was driving, and then I created a GIF. So there you go. That's Astana's sunset. He was driving towards those buildings. And then I think you can, even if your students are not so interested in this lesson, in this topic, in this city, when you personalize yourself and you make relevant connections, that they are related to your personal experience, because they want to know more about that, about you, about their teacher, then it becomes more engaging, right? And we can do that if we have friends all over the world, like you do now. So you have a bunch of friends that you can exchange with now here in the chat box, right? But that brings us to the approach, response, and reducing fearfulness and anxiety. So remember the fox. There's a picture of a fox right here. And then I can tell my students, maybe I took a picture of the same fox, right? When I was living in Bristol, I saw the fox. It was the very first week I was there. I took a picture, but the picture is very blurred and shaky. And then I can be funny, and I can ask my students, do you think I could be a National Geographic photographer based on the quality of my picture? And then they would probably laugh and say no. And then I could tell them that Mr. Trunk, my stuffed elephant, my friend who travels around the world, moved to Bristol with me. And you can see him there on the left. And he's being knighted by Queen Victoria, because we had this crazy baton race with the scholars, the people who got the scholarship. We had this competition. And here is Mr. Trunk. So I create something, relevant, right? Something that my students can relate to, like a mascot for the classroom, for the group. I can also tell them that I was really excited when I graduated. So you can see a very nice picture on the right, top right. I'm holding my degree. You can see the Clifton Suspension Bridge right there behind me. So it's a very nice picture. I asked my wife to take this picture, and then we walked down and I tried to take another picture. I asked my wife to take a picture while I jumped. I said, I'm going to jump and you take a picture, and it's all blurred. You can't really see anything. You can see a cathedral. So, all of those connections, they are engaging because your students, they really want to know. And then this is closer to them because it's something that you lived yourself. And then you can encourage them to do the same. And I think it's novel. So one of the things you can do, so this picture here on the right shows the Wills Memorial Tower. And maybe, I don't know if you knew that, but Winston Churchill used to be the president of the University of Bristol. So there's an office there where we graduated that there was a chair, he used to sit there. And this is curious. And then you can always find information like that so that your students can be more engaged. But then again, there's also the moment that you can talk about brain facts. And I think brain facts are very important for your students to realize that they can always learn. So I got those two pictures from the TED Talks from Perspectives, the National Geographic learning material, and the other one, this teenage brain text from Impact. So the material that you use, National Geographic learning material, has a lot of information on the brain, on psychology and things like that. So I really advise you to read and learn and watch and learn so that you can share with your students. And then they realize that, oh, okay, so this is why I act like this. Oh, so the brain can always learn. I can always learn. I actually created something on Instagram that I call Neuroshot, and I explain, stuff about neuroplasticity or metacognition, brain function and structure. So create a moment in your lesson to talk about things like that, because we have research suggesting that that's actually good for your students' learning. And then for us to wrap up Engage, I think we have to have this mindset that is proposed by Daniel Raven Ellison. We have to explore the world, explore the science of learning a little bit more, how the brain works, how the mind works, because there are amazing adventures to be had right outside our doors. And some of the keywords that I can relate to Engage are coincidences. I think the brain really likes coincidences, like, whoa, so you were also in Bristol and your neighbor was a guy from Kazakhstan, and you have Bristol and Kazakhstan in the same lesson. So what a huge coincidence. And we like strange facts as well, because they're different, they're novel. We also like small changes and variations, so you can always play a game, you can go back to whatever you were doing, you can, leave the book aside for a couple of minutes and do something else related. This is good for the brain. If we always do the same thing all the time, it gets exhausting, and the brain doesn't like that. Gamification, because gamification has, in itself, a rewarding kind of mechanism that, you have to get points, you have to achieve a goal, you have to follow guidelines, but also safety, because your students have to feel welcome. They have to actually believe and feel that they're not going to be intimidated, that they're free to make mistakes and errors, and that, you're there to help them. And brain facts, like I said. So learn a little bit about the brain and share those facts with them. And that brings us to builds then. So there are three elements to build. The first one is prior knowledge. We need to build new knowledge on top of prior knowledge. So we have to activate prior knowledge when we are teaching. And do you do that? Ask yourselves, when do you do that? How do you do that? I'm going to give you an example later on. But you also have to reduce the load, the cognitive load, for their working memory system. Because if you give them too much information too fast, exactly like I'm doing right now, I know I am, it's hard for you to learn, it's hard for you to remember things. But then at least you will have the chance to watch the session again. So, you can always revisit, you can always retrieve things. Now, you can also use your mirror neuron system. And this is something very cool. I'm going to show you how it works, where we can find those neurons in the brain. But it's basically the idea that we can learn by observing others. We can actually predict what they're feeling and what they're thinking, because we have specialized neurons in the brain to do that. And so this is a lesson that I got from Perspectives. And I have a personal connection as well. So I've been to Rio. This is a beautiful monument you can find in Rio. It's called Escadaria Celarón. Jorge Celarón, he's from Chile, an artist who was living in Rio. I think he still lives there. And he started building, this the stairs tile by tile. Actually, he got broken tiles from trash cans, and then people donated stuff. And then after a couple of months, he started getting tiles from all over the world. And maybe you've seen this if you've been to Rio. And I think that shows us that it takes a long time for you to build something, but you can do it little by little, and then it looks amazing. And the lesson that comes in that unit follows this sequence. So you have a lead in, so it's basically something to connect, right? So to start to get our students thinking about what they're going to discuss. The topic or the main target there is to teach modals: obligation, prohibition, permission, and advice. And then they start with what social media sites and apps do you use? So to get students to actually think about those things. It's a lead in, right? And then you have the grammar box, and you have basically what I call noticing, right? So your students are going to look at that, and they are going to notice how grammar works. So they're going to start deducing how, the formulas, the mechanisms of grammar there. And then, and of course, you have the grammar box with some examples like obligation, things that are necessary or not necessary, must, have to, don't have to. And then you have this controlled practice. So controlled practice will give them only two choices. So they have to underline something or a fill in the gap activities. And again, the answers are right there in front of them. So it's much more controlled, right? And finally, you have a freer practice type of activity in which they have to discuss, they have to talk a little bit, and then they don't have the answers right in front of them. So they can use their creativity a little bit more. And this is what the book offers. This is the exact sequence that you can find in the book. So how would you plan that lesson using the build principle of EBC? First of all, I would advise you to look at the unit more holistically. Just go to the end of the unit, come back, see what you can use there. Don't just focus on this particular lesson. So at the end of the unit, you have a TED Talk. And this TED Talk gives you an example of the language, the target language that you want. We have to show them that they will be loved and accepted, not for being perfect, but for being courageous. So I think that's very visual. That's something that engages them. You can use that. You don't have to watch the TED Talk. You can just show that sentence, that quotation. And then you can go to activating prior knowledge, right? So how do you do that? You can create a game. You can use the grammar box, and you can maybe hide some of the answers, some of the modals with, you have tools if you're projecting your screen or something like that. Or you can simply, in the real classroom, face-to-face, you can create a slide and project, or, there are many ways you can do that. Or you can play a game. You can quiz them with Kahoot, with a Mentimeter, so that they have to try to guess the modals, right? And then you have to reduce the working memory load. How can you do that? So there is a text. If you go back, it's all text. It kind of, feels a little heavy for students to digest, right? Here, you can see that it's a little bit cleaner, and then I added some images. So you have a Facebook and Instagram, the logo, so that they can use the images to relate to the text, because they're going to have to talk about things that you can do, things that you must do, and you shouldn't do, right? They're talking about modals. So for example, Facebook and Instagram, 13 years old, what is the connection? And then they can say something like, you must be 13 years old to have an Instagram account or something like that. So instead of focusing too much on text, because it's really heavy for your working memory, you can help your students by reducing that load, basically by offering some images and some phrases. So that's something that you can do. And then another thing you can do that I do all the time, you can use brain breaks. And brain breaks are very short pauses that you can take now and then. I'd say after each, after every 15 or 25 minutes, maybe, depending on the group, because then your students can stop focusing a little bit and start consolidating knowledge. So let's try to test you on Mr. Trunk's adventures. Which of these cities has Mr. Trunk not been to? And you can use the chat box to answer. A, London, B, Zurich, C, Seoul, D, Budapest, or E, Las Vegas. So let's see what, maybe you know Mr. Trunk, maybe you've met him. What do you think? Yeah, he's not being to, okay? So I can see a lot of E, D. Yes, great. I think you're going to be surprised. So I'll show you the evidence. Now, Mr. Trunk has definitely been to London. He's been to Las Vegas. He's been to Budapest last year, as a matter of fact. And he's been to Zurich. So the right answer is C. He's never been to Seoul. He's never been to South Korea. Great. So a brain break is something that will force your students to stop a little. You can play a song. You can watch a video. You can play a game. You can ask them to stand up and move around for a couple of minutes, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. And that's actually good for the working memory system, because then you can kind of start consolidating that and you don't experience cognitive overload, right? And then you have this, the mirror neuron system. And then there's another poll now, because I'm very interested in how you are teaching online. So what kind of strategies do you use? You have there in a remote lesson, what do you usually do? Do you share your video only? You don't share your video. Sometimes you share the video, sometimes you don't. Like, share the video with your slides, or it's just you, no slides, no sharing the screen. So what do you do? I'll give you some time to answer that. So let's wait for the, yeah, Mr. Trunk looks lovely. Yes, I love elephants. By the way, if you want to check out Mr. Trunk's adventures on social media, use the hashtag Mr. Trunk Travels, and you'll see he's been to 21 countries, I think, or 22 maybe. So let's look at the answers. What do you normally do? So most people sometimes share and sometimes you don't share, right? So that's great. So you kind of mix. 64% of you said that. So I'm going to show you why I think that's important. And to do that, I'll stop sharing my slides so that you can see me very big now. And then you can see my brain. I always take my brain everywhere I go, because without my brain, I don't think right. And one of the reasons why it's actually great for us to look at our teachers and educators and people in general, it's because we can learn by observing them, because we have neurons that are specialized in mimicking or imitating what other people do, or activating when people are doing something. We call them mirror neurons, and you can find them in areas related to movement, such as the premotor cortex, the primary motor cortex, the somatosensory cortex that has to do with touch and feeling pressure and texture and things like that. So you can see them in the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, and where they meet here. And they are specialized actually to help us learn by observing. So you can look at someone, have ever done yoga or Pilates or something like that? So you can just look at them, see what they're doing, and then you can almost like instantly move like they are. I mean, sometimes it's much more complicated than that, right? But then basically you can do that, which is amazing. So we have this feature in our brain. Now, do you think that looking at me, showing a real brain, well, not a real brain, but my brain, instead of looking at the slide with many things on the slide, isn't that better? A little bit better now? So what do you think? Because I gave you some variation. Yeah. Don't you feel a little bit, okay, that, he's connecting. Yes, perfect. So you have to do that more often with your students, right? Now, going back to my mirror neurons, and I was in a conference in Romania there, so some people probably met me there. And something else that you can do is, again, create a narrative, create a story. That's why I'm using TED Talks. That's why I'm talking about the Renaissance people, about Leonardo da Vinci, right? And this TED Talk in particular is about how you can build using bamboo trees, right? So she says, Laura Hardy, she says that, and when my father built Green School in Bali, he chose bamboo for all of the buildings on campus because he saw it as a promise. It's a promise to the kids. It's one sustainable material that they will not run out of. And when I first saw these structures under construction about 6 years ago, I just thought, this makes perfect sense. It's growing all around us. It's strong, it's elegant, it's earthquake resistant. That's amazing. And I really think that build has a lot to do with bamboo because it's organic. It's not mechanical. So every now and then, for people to build, you will have to give them different amounts of things. It's not just, mechanic. It's repetitive because you have to keep doing it. Like when Jorge Celarón was building the stairs in Rio, he has to keep coming back and putting all the pieces together. The same thing for Laura Harding and the workers. They have to keep coming back to put all the bamboo trees together. It's repetitive. Because it's repetitive, it's also long-term. But it has to be flexible because students are unique. They have unique brains. They have unique connections in their brain. So it has to be flexible, but also strong, right? Because, it has to be able to endure. It has to actually be able to hold what you're putting on top of that. And finally, it has to be sustainable because they have to be able to keep doing that for some time. So think about bamboo trees. And that brings us to the last bit, consolidate. So consolidate is much more related to sending that fresh or that recently learned information, content, knowledge, and skills to other areas of the brain, to the cortex, so that we can retrieve later. It has to do with rehearsal, repeating things in the brain, and practicing, basically, right? Because once you do that, you free your working memory system to take in more information. But it also has to do with applying that knowledge in different contexts. Otherwise, it's not so useful, right? We can't have just one representation of that knowledge in the brain. We have to have multiple representations of that. And finally, it has to do with sleep. And I'm going to tell you in a bit why sleep is important. So this is a lesson that I got from Impact 2. And this unit deals with natural disasters. And I thought that the picture was amazing. So you have this wildfire. And basically what the students have to learn at the beginning is the vocabulary related to natural disasters like wildfire, breathe, escape, and flames, some examples that I got from the text. One of the things you can do right away to help them rehearse is they read the text, for example, or maybe it was a listening activity. Close your books and try to remember those words, the words that relate to a natural disaster. Maybe you can do something like cued retrieval. So instead of closing the book and trying to remember whatever comes to mind, you show them a picture of something or a quiz or a multiple choice activity so that they have to remember the word. But we have to do that more often. You look at new information and then look away and then try to retrieve that, right? So one of the things you can do right now, and I challenge you to do that for the next 15 seconds, try to remember any of the principles within E, B, or C. I'll give you 15 seconds to do that. Retrieve, bring that information back to your working memory? 15 seconds. Okay, I'm not counting the seconds, but I think I gave you like 10 seconds. So try to bring those concepts back to your working memory, right? And that's something that you can do very easily with your students. But you can also, and you have to be honest, help your students apply that new knowledge in different contexts. And if you think about what the book offers, which is great, I mean, the book offers a variety of activities so that they can apply in different ways, but they're normally written activities, right? So they have to write down something, they have to fill in the gap, and sometimes they have to talk, they have to exchange information, work together in pairs or groups or something like that. But that, is that variation or varied enough for your students to actually build multiple representations of that knowledge? Probably not. So we can think, and we should think of different ways to help them apply that knowledge. This lesson in particular has something very cool. So if you look at the end here, the second page, there's a board game for your students to apply that knowledge there using a board game. So they have to remember the words and they have to apply. So they have to use the words to be able to play the game. And that's amazing. But then there's another way we can apply that doesn't necessarily relate to the book. We can use whatever they're learning in the lesson so that they can apply in their real lives to understand real life facts. And then I was browsing, I was looking for information on the web, and I found a National Geographic website that brings this amazing resource. So there's actually many resources on this website. You have a video of how wildfires start. You have a text on the Brazilian situation now, a tragedy that we're going through in Brazil. A lot of ecosystems are burning, like the Pantanal, which is very similar to a swamp. We have the Brazilian savanna, the Cerrado, and we have the Amazon forest. They're all burning. And then you can see right there that you have the word wildfire. And then they can see that word being applied in a different context. And then you can actually relate that to animals losing their natural habitats. And then I got that somewhere. I actually started looking for another resource and I found one, coincidentally by National Geographic as well. And you can do that. You can relate the fires to the fires going on in Australia or in California because it's closer to their reality. It's more relevant. It's more readily applicable, okay? And then finally, and this is, I will ask Emily or Anders to help me poll you now. Sleep is also very important. So think about homework. When do you normally assign homework? Do you think homework should be done on the same day after your lesson? So you taught this lesson about natural disasters. Should your students get home and do the homework, or should they do it the next day? What do you think? So I'm very interested in your answers. I'll give you some time to do the poll there. And of course, you can also use the chat box. Yeah. They should do it on the following day. Yes. Okay, great. Somebody learned that from me, they said, great. So 51% of you actually think that, yes, we should do it on the same day. 49% said no, the next day. So the evidence suggests that it's actually better for us to retrieve things the next day after we have slept, because then we have consolidated some memory, and the effort for you to retrieve that information, to make it conscious again, bring it back to your working memory, will help you strengthen the neuronal connections in your brain, the memory networks in your brain. So it's better for you to do it the next day. And then I brought the perfect analogy for you. So I have my basil here. And so how many times do you have to water basil normally? I don't know if you guys are into gardening and planting herbs in your place, but I realized that I was giving too much water. I was watering my basil too much. And you can see that the stem got a little brownish. That's not good normally. So if I give too much water on the same day, I'm actually killing the stem. I'm killing the plant. So yes. So if I have to wait, there has to be a space between the last time I water the plant and the next time that I water the plant, kind of like revisiting content. So if your students were exposed to content today, maybe they should sleep and then do it the next day or even 2 days after, or but not on the same day because they might be wasting cognitive resources, right? I hope you remember the plant thing. And then to wrap up, I think the idea that best summarizes the consolidate principle is this one by Anne Morgan. She has an amazing TED talk about how she read stories and books from every single country on the planet for 1 year. She took the year off to read books. And of course, she didn't have access to the books. And then people started sending her books from all over the world. And then she says, when I looked back at much of the English language literature I had grown up with, for example, I began to see how narrow a lot of it was compared to the richness that the world has to offer. And as the pages turned, something else started to happen too. Little by little, that long list of countries that I'd started the year with changed from a rather dry academic register of place names into living, breathing entities. And that's what stories and narratives they can do for us. They can actually make things more concrete, more sort of, palpable or visible in our brains, right? And if you think about it, how can you help your students do that? Graphic organizers use visuals to make, to give them a bigger story to attach to what they're learning. You can use mind maps as well. You can help them work on projects so that they're creating a story around all the content that you taught them, and a very rich story filled with details. They can do debates in the lesson. They can also create their own narratives, and they can create a story. They can use digital tools to do that. And spacing, because stories, they never really happen on the same day, right? I mean, some stories, very short stories, they can happen on the same day, but the best stories, they take some time, and so there has to be spacing because they have to sleep, they have to consolidate memory. Now, let's try to revise that quickly, and then we can move on to questions if we have time. But the idea is, just like the fox exploring Bristol, very engaged, looking for food or shelter, or just having fun, you should engage your students like that. Explore the surroundings, look at the contributions of the science of learning, learn the EBC framework, try to use it more often. Remember Jorge Celarón, the guy who built the stairs in Rio, that you need to build, the little bits, bit by bit, with broken tiles that you can find in different places that people send to you. It takes time, it takes a lot of work, but then the end result is amazing. So look at the stairs. And also think about consolidating in terms of fire, because there's a saying in neuroscience, neurons that fire together wire together. That's called long-term potentiation. So if you can help your students use that knowledge that you gave them in different situations, in different contexts, they are going to be better able to retrieve that later on. It's going to be consolidated in their memories. And of course, many of you might be asking, but well, the books, they have a particular sequence and maybe we have to follow that. I think we can, but I think we can adapt a lot of things. So there's no fixed recipe. What the book gives you, what the book offers, is a general recipe with a lot of interesting, alternatives and options that you can use depending on your groups, depending on your resources. And I think you have to look at the book as the main resource that you have that gives you the scope and sequence and the syllabus, but also something that is very flexible. And if you learn how to apply the EBC framework, then you can have a better idea of how to make your students' learning experience more profitable, more fruitful, or help them achieve better learning outcomes, right? And but there's more to this framework. I actually worked on a different framework for my dissertation. So I put together, consolidate and build in a different theme that I call memory. Engagement is there. We need engagement for attention, for memory, and for learning. But then memories is a different theme. And then we also have to worry about things like personalization, active learning, beliefs and attitudes, because many times the reason why your students are not ready to learn is because they believe they are not ready to learn. And you can teach them about the brain, you can teach them about growth mindset, self-efficacy, neuroplasticity, so that they learn, oh, so I can learn, I can always learn. Learning is what the brain does, right? And you also have to worry about continuous assessment. So my hope is that with this talk, you can start thinking about how we can integrate arts and science, because that's what Da Vinci used to do. That's what the Renaissance was all about, right? Using science to make better art and using art to represent science. That's why 400 years later, we, human beings created flying machines. It's because we designed them, because we studied, we observed, we became more empirical. And I think that we have to do that for teaching and learning as well. We have to look at the sciences of learning, the cognitive sciences, learn how the brain learns, learn how the mind learns, what that means for behavior, and use some of those contributions to design better lessons and deliver better lessons. Remember, Da Vinci, a man ahead of his time. I think it's high time we started reintegrating science into teaching, into language arts. Thank you very much. Don't forget to follow me on social media. So if you want to check out my blog, edcrocks.com, I normally write about stuff like that. And that's it. I think I don't have a lot of time for questions, but I'm all ears.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andre, for that great second session. Thanks everyone for being here with us. I see a few questions about your blog. It is right on the screen.
Yes.
I'm going to
type, yes, right there.
Yeah. So definitely be sure to check that out. Follow Andre on social media channels for all of his interesting content that he shares. But thanks everyone for being here. Yeah, I don't think we have time for questions. I'm just going to double check the question box here. I do see a question during the session was asked by Sue about assigning homework. Should they do it the next day? That was the concluding point, right?
Yes, I think doing it the next day is probably the best option, because then they will have consolidated some memory. They can revisit some of the concepts. So you add some spacing, and of course, they have to revisit that again and again and again for a couple of sessions. We don't know how many. It depends on their prior knowledge. It depends on the resources they're using, but the next day, it's probably the best option.
Great, thank you. And I do see one question, Anzara, about games for the online classes. I know we really didn't cover it too much in this session, and there's a lot more to that. Just so you know, Zara, we do have several previous webinars that do cover some games and links that you can use for online classes. Andre, I don't know if there's anything you want to add there.
Yes, but I think the idea of gamifying things, clear goals, and there's an outcome and there's a reward when you finally achieve the goal, and there's a competition, but there's also a lot of collaboration, is actually very rewarding for the brain. We have the reward system. It releases dopamine, for example, and dopamine makes us want to do things. It's that I feel like doing this kind of feeling that we get when we have a dopamine rush in the brain.
Great. And Holly asked if you're a course writer.
Yes. Well, I mean, if I am a course writer, I did, yeah. I did write a couple of courses, and I actually reviewed one of the NGL materials, Look, which is a great book, and I'm very proud to be on the team. But yes, I do write a couple of things. Yep.
Great. So I think on that note, we're right on the hour. We can wrap up. And just so you all know, I know there's questions coming in. You will be receiving a certificate for being with us today and spending the hour. So You'll get that within 5 business days, along with a recording of the session, and we'll also send through a PDF on the slides. We do always post the slides on our webinar archive, so you can always check that out at eltngl.com/webinars. And one last thing I just wanted to make sure you all know about, we're running a showcase right now for teachers of English called Learning Moments, where we're asking you to share the ways that you've been engaging your students in online teaching for the past several months. We're pretty open on how you share your learning moment with us. You can either upload just a short video with a tip that you want another teacher to know, or you can send us a picture of an activity you've been doing, something you found successful in your online classes, along with a written description. You can check out the site, eltngl.com/learning-moments. It's below. To see some of the submissions that teachers have sent in from all over the world. We have 100 up there right now, and it's really wonderful to see the community that's come together around this and to see all the great submissions that have been sent in. And at the end of the showcase, Dr. Joan King-Shin and Jared Borup will be selecting a few of these learning moments to feature in their new upcoming professional development book. So just wanted to make sure you all know about that. Please spread the word, and we'd love to see your participation in it. And last but not least, we hope you join us again soon. We have several more webinars going on through December. You can check them out on our webinar website, and be sure to check out our InFocus blog too. Andre will have a post going up with a lesson plan in there too to go along with his framework, and that should be up in the next week. It's on eltngl.com/infocus. Great.
All
Well, I
right.
just want to say thank you, everyone. I'm going to direct you to a feedback survey now. We'd love to hear what you thought of the session, and we hope you see you at a webinar again soon.
Thank
And a
you
big
very
thank you to our
much.
presenter, of course, too.
Yes, thank you very much, Emily. It was a pleasure. And make sure you check the blog, and it's going to be up there next week with a lesson plan based on the EBC framework. Thank you again.
All right, everyone. Have a great rest of your afternoon, morning, or evening, wherever you are. Bye, all.
Bye-bye.